I want you guys to understand that there are four kinds of people in Eaglesoft. There is the person, there is a patient, there is a policyholder, and there is a responsible party. And the reason those designations are so important is this. Somebody can be a person in Eaglesoft, but that doesn't mean that they are a patient. They could be a person and be a policyholder, a person and responsible party. So you have to realize that the way that Eaglesoft works, if you're in the schedule and you're looking for a policyholder, you're not going to find it because only patients can be found in the schedule. And that happens a whole lot when patients call in or people call into the office and they want to schedule a first visit. Well, it could be a dad who is a policyholder or a responsible party who's never been to the office before or never been set up in the system as a patient, and you won't be able to find them. And then all of a sudden, you'll realize you have two of the same people because you have one that's a person, meaning they have a policyholder or responsible party, and one that is now a patient. So just be aware if you're looking for a new person, you should always go to your icon up here that says person and look for the people who are in this list. It's a weird designation, but long term, it actually makes a lot of sense because we can connect people no matter what their designation is in the system. So let's just start with, I'm going to always use my Charles Average because that's the guy I always kind of pick on in my system. Don't worry about HIPAA. These are all phony names and people, so don't worry about seeing anybody's personal information in my setup. It's all made up things. So I'm going to edit this screen and I'm going to share this out so you guys can see it. Here's my person list. And now what you're going to see is I'm going to go to my person and I'm going to edit this guy. I'm going to share this one out individually to you too. So here is the edit patient screen in Eaglesoft. Now I'm on version 20. If you're on any of the modern versions, 16, 17, 18, 19, it should look pretty much the same. Version 18, we get this masked social security number, but everything else should pretty much look the same if you're on 16, 17, 18, 19, or 20. So it should look pretty much the same. So from this screen, a couple things I want to go through with you guys. And I'm going to go down all three columns and try to go through everything, try to give you an idea of how patients should be set up and how families are interconnected. So we're going to start from first name. Believe it or not, it's important. First name should be proper first name. And I always use myself, and whenever I use an example, I always use myself. My first name is Tony, and it is not Andre. So if you put Andre in here, MetLife, who is the dental insurance that I have, is going to deny your claim because the claim's going to go in for Andre and they're going to have no idea who I am, or they're going to send you a denial because they'll ask, well, how come that social security number is with the wrong person? So you want to have proper first names here. And proper first names is one of the reasons I've always used driver's licenses when I get information from patients, because that's going to be the proper first name for that patient. So I always get driver's license so that I know legal name, which hopefully is going to be the name that's on the insurance. Plus, I like having this information. So first name, last name, and then if there is a junior or senior, don't put a comma, don't put a period after junior, just space JR or space senior. And the interesting thing is if you put that they're the second, so you're going to put two I's, be aware if you don't put them in caps, it's going to stay as lowercase. All right. So middle initial, grab them if you got them, and then preferred names or nicknames. Now, it might sound crazy, but nicknames can be a bit troublesome. If you put Charles in that same spot, because we prefer to call Charles Charles, if you put Charles down there, then you're going to see recall cards or correspondence going out where it will say, "Dear Charles Charles." So really what you want to do is if they go by Charles, then you leave this blank. If they have a nickname, you put that in there. And don't put anything in there like special pronunciations of names. I've seen that a lot of times in offices because that might show up on a recall card, or some electronic service might call the patient and say something odd to the patient when they're trying to confirm an appointment. So always use proper first name and then any nickname that the patient has here. Salutations, you can use them if you're going to send proper letters to patients, but If you're not, don't worry about it. I leave it blank if I don't need to. Then, is this person a patient, a policyholder, or a responsible party? Now, if you've used other softwares in the past, a lot of other softwares require that you made the policyholder the responsible party. In Eaglesoft, that's not a necessary evil. You can do whatever you want with connecting patients. Now, I'll leave it up to you guys to decide who is going to be, quote unquote, the responsible party, but the responsible party just means that they get the bill. So you could have a family set up so that the responsible party's dad, the policyholder's mom, and the kids are just patients. Not a problem. Now you could have a kid who goes out and gets a job and they have a separate secondary policy. They could be their own policyholder and have their parent be the secondary policyholder and still have dad get the bill. It doesn't make a difference. We can connect them any way we want. And whatever you decide you want to do as far as responsible parties and who gets insurance and who doesn't, that's up to you, but you can connect people in any way you want. All right. So patient means they get treatment. Policy means the name is at the top of the policy. Responsible party means they get the bill. And your connection to these people is whatever way you want to make them. Then we're going to look at addresses. When you put in an address, make sure you're consistent with street, lane, avenue. Just abbreviate it the same way over and over again, because when you get down to things like the city and the zip codes, if you don't stay consistent, you're going to have things like, instead of New York City, you'll have NYC in some instances, and New York in other instances. So be aware that if you do that, you're going to have these zip codes yell at you and say, you said NYC, and that doesn't match what we have on file for that zip code, and you're going to continue to have that battle. So stay consistent with the way you write these cities and zip codes. All right. Home phone, obvious, work number. This is for your extension and cell phone. If somebody says that their cell phone is their home number, the best option is to put it in both places. Now, based on the confirmation system you're using, you might have some pushback from them and they might tell you to do something different. But for the purpose of Eaglesoft, sometimes if somebody has a cell number and doesn't have a home number and you run a report, it might not actually have a cell number on that report you're running, which means you're just going to have to go back to the software to find the number. So for me, I like putting both, if they have a cell number as home number, in both places. Hope that makes sense. Now, the other thing is with pager, if somebody leaves a message for you and it's a number you've never seen before, but you don't want to assume it's a new phone number, put it in pager until you talk to them and verify what it is, because most people don't have pagers anymore, but it's a great secondary field to put a number in until you verify that it's a correct number or not. The next section, male, female. This will default to female. 60% of our patient base should be female, and it's going to default to female. And one of the questions that I've gotten recently is, what about the new gender types that are going to be showing on a lot of the insurance forms? That's something that's a bridge we'll have to cross when we get to it. Eaglesoft can only do male, female at this point, but it's coming, and I'm sure it's going to be part of the future of most softwares where they'll have more choices here. Same thing with marital status. I typically leave this as unknown. The only time I ever change this is if I'm aware that they are divorced, separated, or widowed. That's the only three options I ever use other than unknown. If they tell me they're married, I just sort of say, shake my head, and I just leave it as unknown. I will mark it as divorced, separated, or widowed, so I don't make the mistake of calling somebody and telling them that their spouse should come into the office. So I just I use it for personal reasons. It has absolutely nothing to do with insurance processing, and that doesn't reflect any place in the 88 form when you submit a claim. Birthdays are obvious, and then if you're on version 18, 19, or 20, you're going to have a masked social security number. Unless you click in that box, then you can see the social. If you have the security clearance through the security profiles to be able to see that. If you don't, it's always going to be hidden, and you're never going to see it. All right. Now, one other thing I want you to see is up here under chart ID, I always put some name or some designation for the patient. So if I had two Charles averages or Charles Jr. and Senior, I didn't know which one was which. I could put up here something like Tall Guy. All right. And that way I know which, whoops, if I could spell, I'd be dangerous. That way I know which one's which, or if he's the redhead guy, or if he's the one that rides the Harley. So I put a designation there so that if I have two people with the same name, I can quickly know who that guy is. And this will not show up any place in any correspondence with the patients or anything like that. But I'll show you when I open up my patient list. Let me go back to my patient list. When I open up my patient list, if you look down this list right here, you can see that now this is my demo database. I can quickly see this is an adult ortho patient, there's a perio patient, there's a teenager, there's an ortho case. I can quickly see that this guy right here is in collections. So even if this was an account that was inactive, I can tell from this screen, and I got this idea from Dana, and I know Christine also does this. I will quickly be able to tell that this person is in collections, and I won't have to open their account in order to see that information. So it's a great way to just quickly go down the list to be able to see what's going on with the patient. Now I'm going to sneak back over here to the edit patient screen. Let me share that back to you guys. All right. And let's see. Good. Okay, so back to the edit patient screen, and let's finish going down the list. So driver's license, if you need to get that information, is fine. Email addresses, and again, depending on the communication tools you're using, you'll be able to get the email addresses. And then I'm going to come back to insurance in a minute after we talk about some of the other preferences, but I'm going to jump up here to this field, which is the recall notes field. And the recall notes field is used for a couple of things. A lot of offices will write things in there like, you know, make sure to remember to bring their night guard in when they come in for a checkup or something like that. But what I used to utilize this field for, and what works really well, is you see that W that's up there? What I can do with that W is I can reactivate patients or call patients or, you know, do whatever I want to run reports about those patients through Money Finder. Because I used to set up Eaglesoft so that I could tell anybody with a W was a whitening patient, anybody with a P was a perio patient, anybody with a I was an implant patient, anybody with an O was an ortho patient. Anybody that I referred to Dr. Scott, I put DRS for Dr. Scott. And I could run a report on this and be able to tell, you know, who had whitening and who saw Dr. Smith, who did this but did this, who had a crown and also saw the implant specialist. So I was able to run a bunch of different reports and be able to go through Money Finder to be able to utilize that field for anything I wanted. But imagine if I wrote in here web designer, and then I tried to look for my whitening patients, that W from web designer would have pulled it into my list with my whitening patients. So you have to be careful if you want to use it, that field, but it's a great way to be able to do some other kinds of reactivation. All right. The next field down is their next recall date. And the next recall date is stimulated by the date that you put in preferences. I'm going to open this box just for a minute so you can see what's over here in preferences. So I have this patient on a 6-month recall. So this date would automatically update 6 months based on the procedure codes that you choose to trigger your recall. So in most offices, that's going to be a prophy or perio maintenance, and that would make the patient's recall status update 6 months from then. So the reason this patient's recall date, next recall date, is in yellow is caution, they're overdue for their recall, is because they're due for 6 months. So they must have been in February of 2006. And I can tell from this next box down that they have no preventive appointments scheduled. All right. But they do have a restorative appointment scheduled. So that's why it's yellow. It's letting me know immediately that this patient is overdue for their recall. All right. All right, I got a message here. I just wanted to make sure I'm answering. Yep, okay, good. Now, the other thing is at the bottom, we've got these boxes for, did the patient receive their HIPAA notifications? I will tell you that I never use these boxes because to me, it's redundant. Nobody gets past the front desk in my office unless they've signed a HIPAA notification. If they haven't agreed to the HIPAA notification, then more than likely they're not going to be a patient of the practice. So why would I check these boxes on everybody? Free checks for everybody that comes in the office when I already know that everybody who comes in the office has it. So it's almost like, you know, a checkbox that says they're here in my office for dentistry. Well, what else would they be here for? So it just seems to be a redundant step for me. So I never used it. And we go down to the next box down, which is this box shows all the family members who are connected to this patient. So everybody who shares a responsible party will be listed as family members through this box. And the other thing you'll notice about this box is if you notice that my mouse changes into a mouse and the right button turns red, that's letting me know that I can just right click on Tim and I can switch to Tim's information. So the beauty of that is you don't have to leave this screen to get through the other members of the family. So this time of year, you know, like so imagine Christmas, everybody got new cell phones. So I could go here and update Tim's cell phone, right click on Mary and update her cell number, and then go back to Charles, right click and switch to Charles's cell phone and update everybody all in one screen without having to close and open and close and open. So I hope everybody knew that that existed. Anytime you see a mouse open up in a lot of these fields, that just means that you can right click and do something else within that field. All right. Now let's go up, and I'm going to skip registration. I'm going to look at the preferences next. So when we have the preferences window open, there's only a couple things that we really want to concentrate on here, and that really has to do with our ID numbers. Now, the only ID numbers I ever use are the Medicaid ID for those offices that take Medicaid and the primary member ID. I never use the employer ID or the carrier ID because I want to stay consistent with using the software to know that if there's an ID number, it's going to be a primary member ID. And in most cases, there are only two that require, and that's federal employees that have an R number, like this guy here, or Aetna Aetna members who have a W number. But most of the others, and I say most of the others will be able to find the patient through social. So most of the time I'll be using social. Other than that, I'm going to use primary member ID and place it in this field. Now, by doing that, I have to make sure that my employer, go back over here to the employer, is set up. All right. So my employer is set up, all right, in their preferences to use the primary member ID. All right. In this field, it's a little confusing because it actually says policyholder member ID, but it's the primary member ID. All right. So that's the one I want to make sure is connected in the employer field, employer preferences, if I'm using the ID number in the patient preferences. Now, one other thing I'll do, and I didn't have it set up on this one, but in the name of the employer, I typically write primary member ID. That way I know that any plan that has that designation at the end of it, I need to get an ID number from the patient. That it's not going to let me process this claim unless I have an ID number. So I always put that in my name so that I know to get that information. And you can see in my examples here of my other employers, see I have up here PID, patient ID number. So I always look at this list and I can tell primary member ID. I know that I need to get it before I can process a claim for this, for anybody in this group. Got it? So let's go back over here and we're going to go back to sharing my editation screen. All right, so that is that primary member ID. Let's open this back up so I can see. Good. And remember, if you guys have any questions or if I'm going too fast for you, just type me a message so I can, so I know. And if you want me to cover something again or get some clarity on something, just type a message over on the side. And then we'll have some time to do some Q&A if you want to at the very end. All right. So primary member ID goes here. All right. And then, okay, can I go to the last step again? So the last step about how to connect the ID number to the employer. I'm going to assume that's what you mean. So let's go back, and I'm going to go back over here to employer. So remember, this says primary member ID. So I'm going to go to my employer list, and I'm going to have to share that out so you can see it. Employers. So here's my employer list, and this guy works for the US government. And remember, at the very end of it, I put primary member ID here so that I could tell that this patient needs a primary member ID. And when I edit that employer, I'm going to go over here to preferences, and I'm going to make sure that this is designated to use the primary member ID or policyholder ID so that that's what prints onto the claim form. Now, some people have tried to trick the system by putting things into the the carrier ID field. So they'll put stuff in the carrier ID field, and instead of using this carrier ID checkbox up here, they'll say Social Security number and carrier ID with the hope that if one is missing, the other one will pick up. But the problem is, if you have both, it'll be too much information and it'll actually not show at all. Why are you not using okay, well, okay, so the question is, why don't I use the other fields? Why don't I use carrier ID or so let me show you. And I'll go back to my, okay. So the reason I don't use the employer ID or the carrier ID is because, to be consistent, to make sure that nobody is making a mistake in the offices that I work with, I want to make sure that we know in our office we have two spaces to use. Primary space would be social, secondary space would be primary member ID. So that way people aren't saying, oh, well, that's right, Aetna uses a carrier and MetLife uses an employer ID and such uses a primary. So I just want to say, it doesn't matter who it is. If there's a secondary ID other than social, it goes under primary member ID. So that's why I don't use the other fields. I hope that answers your question. I just think it's crazy to try to remember which uses which one. Cool, good. I'm glad that answered your question. Yeah. I only put things in primary member because if it's not a social, it's a primary ID as far as I'm concerned. When they started using ID numbers and not socials, they actually called them PIDs, P-I-D, patient identification number. And that's why I started using it that way, and I haven't changed for 20 years. So that way I just know from office to office, there's only two options, social or primary member. Hope that helps. So let's take a look at the other things that are here, which are at the very bottom of the screen, because none of this other stuff really is going to help you. And I say that, oh, yep, it looks like we're going to run out of time in 10 minutes. So we're having an issue with this. So I think this will go to 9:40 and we're going to get cut off. So down at the bottom of the screen, we've got a pre-med button. And that pre-med button allows us to actually check a box and pick what types of pre-medication we're going to give to our patient. And as you can see right now, I've got templates set up for pre-medication for Amox or pre-medication for clindamycin. And what will happen is when I go to schedule this patient, I'll get an immediate alert that says that patient needs to be pre-medicated. Would you like to prescribe now? And give me the choice to prescribe this clindamycin for them. It'll also put a pill onto the schedule automatically because I've checked that box. So I love that. The only issue is it doesn't warn you anytime other than when you scheduled the appointment. It's not going to warn you when when you're confirming or anything else. You'll see the pill, but there won't be any other kind of warning. But it's a great little feature. All right. On the right side, I've got discounts, which I never really use, but I'm just showing you here that you could have a discount set up for family members. I mean, I have golf buddies, I have senior discounts, I have college students. So you could set up a discount here, but just be aware if you do set up a discount, that patient will always get the discount. So I use the example of, imagine somebody's getting a crown and you're going to give them a, say, 15% discount. And then all of a sudden they want to use care credit. Now that you're going to lose 4, 5, 6% in finance charges using care credit. So now you've got a 20% discount by doing that. So instead of using a discount, I typically will set up something where somebody gets a adjustment at the time of service if I was going to be doing some sort of an adjustment. But I never set up these discounts, but I just wanted you guys to see how that goes. The same thing with fee schedules. You'll probably have heard me a million times talk about that I never attach fee schedules to the patient. And the reason I don't attach fee schedules to the patient is the fee schedule that you're using for a patient really has to do with their employer and has nothing to do with the patient. It's always about the employer when it comes to allowances for Delta or MetLife or whatever. That's an employer-driven fee schedule and not a patient-driven. And remember, if you have to update fee schedules under patients, you've got thousands of patients and really only hundreds of insurance plans. So really the easier one to update is insurance or employers and not patients. So don't put anything here, because if I put a MetLife fee schedule here and all of a sudden this patient is now not insured, they're still going to get the MetLife fees unless I individually go into every patient and take this out. So always mark that as none. All right, and then back down to my recall frequency. This should be set for 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, or if the patient comes to you off and on from a periodontist or something, mark it as 8 months if they're every 4 months in your office, or every 12 months if they're only in your state 6 months out of the year or something. So change that to 12 months for somebody who's only in the office every other visit. All right, so that's your preferences. And the only other thing that I really wanted to go through over here is the memo field. And the memo field allows you to take some notes about the patient and leave them as part of the patient record without being a permanent part of the record. So if there's a note that you want to write about a patient, you know, that they prefer to have a pillow, or if they want to be called at a, you know, if they're you know, their son or daughter or whatever picks them up, or paratransit picks them up, or if there's, you know, they just spent the summer in Greece or something like that and you want to put that in the records. This memo field is a great place to put a note about somebody, but as you can see in my example, it's also a place where if you want to put a personal message about a person, you can, and if you ever need to delete it, it can be deleted, and it's not part of the permanent record for the patient. So just as a FYI, it's a great place to store information about a patient. That's not a permission to put people's credit card numbers in there, because that's not something you should be storing. So let's do this. I think we've got in about 5 minutes before this thing cuts us off, and I apologize for that. So let's do this. If anybody has any questions, why don't we do that? If you want to, if your microphone works, you can just say question and I'll turn your microphone on. Or if you want to just type a question, and I'll answer anything you guys have as far as questions. Let's see. If someone has a tough name to say, where would you put that? Good question. So that's what I would put up here in this chart ID, like AUNDREE. So okay, so if you didn't know how to spell, say Andre, but you know, when you want to write it phonetically, then that's kind of the way I would do it. And again, if I'm looking at my patient list, I could see Andre written in under the patient's name, and I can see the phonetic spelling of it in the chart ID. So I use that field as a way to ID my patient. That's a great question, and that's exactly where I put it. Let's see if anybody else is going to type something here. And I'm going to share that screen with you, my patient list. Let's save that first. So you can see here, although I have preferred name here, and you can see right there, it says Andre right there. Okay, and let's see, how are you updating HIPAA? What signs? Okay, so for HIPAA, when if there is no reason to update HIPAA unless you've changed your HIPAA notification. So if you change some of the rules, then there's a reason to change your HIPAA notifications. And if you do that, so imagine you updated your HIPAA forms for January, then what you're going to need to do is everybody gets a new HIPAA form. So it just doesn't matter. And I'm using IntelliCares to be able to tell if somebody has a HIPAA notification on file. So I would set up a IntelliCare that would automatically put an H on my schedule or something like that if somebody is still without having a HIPAA. And that's what triggers it. So when you save a document, that's what triggers that HIPAA notification. You save your HIPAA documentation, it automatically takes away that H from my schedule. And they're all, those IntelliCares are listed in the group. Let's see what else. And okay, so somebody was asking about that recall notes field. What other things am I putting up there? So yeah, I do W for whitening, I do O for ortho, I do P for perio, I do I for implants. But remember, you don't have to do that anymore because we can do some other things. Now that offices are doing implants, we can do something where we can say, show me anybody who had a 6010 and they had something else. So you don't have to do it for a lot of cases. If somebody had Invisalign, show me anybody who had a 8090 and something else. So a lot of offices, now that you're doing implants, ortho, those kind of things, you really don't have to do that. And you can do it through an IntelliCare. You don't have to use those recall note boxes. But if you're interested, I can show you that. And yep, somebody said with the HIPAA notifications triggering it from the IntelliCare, yes, it's the same thing with financial arrangements. We can have an FA that shows up if somebody doesn't have a financial arrangement on form using the same kind of IntelliCares. And that's one of the webinars we're going to do is on IntelliCares, so people know how to use those, because those are huge. And they make a big difference to be able to look at your schedule and tell exactly what's going on with the patient based on what you see from the IntelliCare. And I'll open up my schedule real fast to show you before it gets cut off. And there's my schedule. So hopefully you guys can see my schedule here on the screen, and you can see all of the IntelliCares that I have running down my schedule. So I can tell right from this view, this patient is due for a full series, they're due for bite wings, they have a treatment plan that it was referred out that's incomplete. This person has a treatment plan that's that's over $1,000 that's incomplete. So I can tell a lot about patients right from my schedule. This person needs to review their eligibility. So from these IntelliCares, I can tell so much about patients without having to do a whole lot of checking. I do my entire huddle right from this screen. So hope that helps you guys. I think we're going to get cut off in less than a minute, but if you have any questions, you guys know how to get in touch with me. You can send me a private message through the group, or you can call me. You can do whatever you need to do in order to get in touch with me. But hope you guys had a good time, and if there's any questions, just shoot me messages and we will answer them as quickly as possible. So have a good night, and thanks. Hopefully you guys don't just get cut off without saying goodbye.